Okay, we're in Kuf Tesvav, continuing Halacha Aleph. Today we're going to talk about what we call Chalav Stam. We're going to do a big chunk today. Unfortunately, there's too much here to fit into our regular time slot. So I'm going to cut down, and if anybody wants to hear the more details, we'll talk later. Okay, to start, we have to remind ourselves where we were last time and continue from there. Which was last time we mentioned the Machlokes Pri Chadash and the Chasam Sofer as to whether the Takana of Chol Yisrael means that a Yid has to actually watch it. Is the Takana the Yid must watch it or do what counts for that? Or if the Chacham were just telling us, make sure you're getting kosher milk, and if you have other ways, from the regular rules in the Torah of how you can figure these things out, chazakas and all kinds of things like that, that works. And based on that, the Pri Chadash said, Pri Chadash is Mekel. He said, if it's not financially viable and there's no treif animals around, then the guy didn't put in treif milk, and you're okay. You could drink it. Okay, so the Pri Chadash, I may have mentioned last time, says that the Radbaz says holds like him. He brings the Radbaz. The Chasam Sofer, to support himself, brings a Kesef Mishnah who says like him, and a few places that the Ramah is meduik to say like him. And it's also the Pri Chadash himself says, I'm right about what I'm saying, but all the parties can disagree with me. Okay, so you just think about what trying to think about putting the names on the different sides. He says, he's like, but everybody else disagrees with what I'm saying, but I'm really right. Okay. In the later poskim, many of them, if we count the numbers, most of them say like the Chasam Sofer, Chacham Sodom, the Aruch Shulchan, it's a Kan Aaron, it's a truth from a sefer written between the two world wars, Tzemach Tzedek, and the Minchas Alazar, and the Chelkas Yaakov. All these Achronim are basically say like the Pri Chadash. I'm sorry, like the Chasam Sofer, yes. They also, a number of those names that I just mentioned, say another thing, which is, doesn't really make a difference whether the Pri Chadash or the Chasam Sofer is right in theory, but Chazal make takanas, they have hidden reasons behind the takanas. They tell us one reason why you have to do it, and there are other hidden reasons. And so even if we covered the revealed reason, we now know that it's kosher milk, but the hidden reasons why it might be aren't being covered, so we can't do anything without the Chazal said, which is a variation, not really the Chasam Sofer, but a variation. Okay. In contrast to all of that I just said to you, the Chazon Ish says that the din is like the Pri Chadash. Okay? The Chazon Ish in the Sefer says that the Pri Chadash is right. He doesn't mention all these names I just gave to you, but he says the Pri Chadash is bad, right, and you could be Mekel. Now, Rav Vosner brings in his tshuvas that before the Chazon Ish printed the Sefer, the Chazon Ish came over to him, they both lived in Bnei Brak, and Chazon Ish came over to him and said to him, what do you think about this thing that I'm about to say? Okay, what do you think that I'm about to say? And my raya is that the Pri Chadash is right. And Rav Vosner tried to convince him that he was not correct. Okay, he told him why his rayas were not so good, and blah blah blah. But now that's how Rav Vosner leaves the conversation off, as if he won. But of course, we all know that in the printed sefer it says Chazon Ish obviously didn't buy it. The sefer was printed afterwards. He said he told me this before he printed the sefer. And you may also know, you probably have heard that the Chelkas Yaakov, a Rav in Europe, said that Rav Moshe Soloveitchik went to the Chazon Ish and asked him if he really was Mekel, and the Chazon Ish gave him a response that gave the impression that he was not Mekel. Okay? So to that, though, as to what the Chazon Ish held, I'll tell you that Rabbi first says he doesn't accept any of these ideas of what the Chazon Ish held. And he says he's a raya from the Chazon Ish himself. The Chazon Ish, in his siman about shiurim, brings that Shulchan Aruch says a certain shir, which is in line with what the Chazon Ish held, says a certain shir, and people, a whole bunch of Sfarim afterwards report that Shulchan Aruch changed his mind, and really he was more Mekel afterwards. He changed his mind about what he held, and the Chazon Ish says, we don't accept those reports, even though they're from reputable people. I mean, the big people who said that, because if the person wrote a sefer, and he changed his mind, in the next printing he should have adjusted what it said in the printed sefer. The sefer was printed again after, while he was still alive, so why didn't he change it? Why didn't he change what it said afterwards? LMI, if he didn't change it, that's because he really holds that's what it is, and we don't know what to say with the stories, but the printed sefer says like this, that's what he holds. So it first says the new, the Chazon Ish, if that's what the Chazon Ish said about somebody else, we say the same about the Chazon Ish. The sefer was printed many times in his lifetime, and it says in the printed sefer that he was Mekel, and everybody else who says that he really didn't mean it, he didn't say it. The story with the Moshe Soloveitchik, he made a joke. He didn't say I didn't hold it. He made like a joke about it. So whatever he held, so Rabbi first says the Chazon Ish was Mekel. Which is what it says. If you open the sefer, that's what it says that he was Mekel.
My father was in America in 1947.
Your father, okay? Father, okay.
Of course, the Chazon Ish. We met Chazon Ish, and after a trip, when he said he suffered because of the milk. Chazon Ish said he didn't have to suffer for the milk.
He didn't have to suffer. You could have had milk, you see. Okay, so here we go. Now we'll write down the next thing. Rabbi says like this. Okay, so anyway, that's what it is. So on.
Nobody blames Barak. People in show go. You find groups of people that are pure Chazanish.
They don't take Chazanish. They don't take Chazanish.
What?
I know it's not no, this whole Stam. Yes.
That's called chocolate.
Yes.
That's called chocolate.
Yes, it's called Stam.
Important product.
That's called chocolate.
Okay,
so made there.
Okay, so So it's available. So
and made with Hebrew language.
So on the simplest level, if we want to know if you could drink milk in the United States without it's not Chalav Yisrael, could you drink milk? The simplest answer is it depends whether you pass on to Pri Chadash, you pass on to Chasam Sofer. Pass on to Chasam Sofer, you can't eat it. You pass on to Pri Chadash, you could eat it. I'm getting there. Give me a minute. Give me a second. I told you to talk about Chalav Stam. What are you
down for 1 week?
So that's what you would think. That's on the simplest level. You would say the Chazanish, according to the Chazanish, it's mutter, according to Chazanish and Pri Chadash, it's mutter. According to the Chasam Sofer and all those other names that I told you, it would be us. That would be the simple way of looking at it. And plenty of people say that. That's what I'm telling you. Is plenty of people who say the Chasam Sofer says it's usher, and that's the end of the day. Okay. But all of that changed when, in the span, if you look at the tshuvas, in the span of about 3 months, Moshe wrote 3 tshuvas to the same person, a person named Rabbi Yehuda Dick. He wrote 3 tshuvas to the same person. In which he completely turned that upside down. Okay, he changed what everyone's thinking until then. Today we're going to talk about the first 2 of those tshuvas, which are very interconnected, and the third tshuva, which is lesser known, but is really very negated to us. The third tshuva, and even probably more controversial in my mind than the first 2. The third tshuva, we can explain. Okay, but today we're going to talk about just the first 2, which is the parts you probably heard before, the more famous parts of what Moshe says. And that is, Moshe wants to say that the Chasam Sofer would agree, even the Chasam Sofer would agree that in America you could drink milk that's not Chalav Yisrael. That's the overall point that he's trying to make is that don't think it's dependent on this machlokes. Even the Chasam Sofer would be mekel because maybe they didn't like the Chasam Sofer, but it's not the case. Even the Chasam Sofer would be mekel. How can he say that? Where would that come from? That the Chasam Sofer would be mekel. So he says, let's accept that the Chasam Sofer says that it's a takana that the yid has to watch the milking. If we look in the procedural rules, Hilchos Eidos in the Torah, there are many dinim that require a person to see something. But when that din says you have to see it, it doesn't mean you have to eyeball it. You don't have to actually watch it happen. There are many, Moshe brings a bunch of examples, I'll give you some. He brings a bunch of examples where the Torah says you have to see something happen. The Eidos doesn't happen unless you see it, but in truth, you don't have to see it. In truth, it could work even if you don't see it. For example, the Gemara says that when a person, very appropriate for sitting here right by the Skype, the Bezin Skype, the din is that for a person to become a ger, the Bezin has to, among the things that have to happen, the Bezin has to see the person go to the mikveh. Okay, the Bezin has to watch the person go to the mikveh. Taisa says in Yavamas, in one explanation, that if there are situations where the Bezin does not actually physically see the person go to the mikveh, they know that it happened. How they know is not important to us. They know that the person went to the mikveh, and the Bezin knows that they went to the mikveh, the person is a ger. The ger is good. What happened? The din is that a Bezin has to see the person go to the mikveh. Doesn't make a difference. Okay, and Rabbi brings in many rayas like this, that what we call a yediyah b'lo riyah. There are ways that a person could know something without seeing it, and that level called yediyah b'lo riyah, what Rabbi calls it's an anan sahadi. When you literally anan sahadi is much like in the English word of it, anan sahadi. We're the edim. Meaning, even though we didn't see it, we all can testify that it happened, and that's good enough for dini. Rabbi brings a number of examples from Hilchos Ishus and Hilchos Iggeros and Hilchos Mamanis. It means a bunch of different rayas that these kind of things work, and therefore an anan sahadi works, and therefore Rabbi says in America that the government oversees the dairy industry. The government requires that people only use cow's milk. People only use cow's milk and not other milks. That gives us the anan sahadi that the milk we're getting is in fact cow's milk. And Mamela, we can be sure that we're getting cow's milk. So even though the din is you need a yid to watch it, it's true. Chacham made takana the yid has to watch it. That this counts. That this is also considered not that the yid he didn't physically watch it, but it has the same level in a beis din. This would be considered that the yid watched it, and that's good enough. So right. So it's considered Chalav Yisrael. Right. So now, in order to distinguish what Ramesh is describing versus the traditional Chalav Yisrael, people made up a term. Ramesh doesn't use this term. A term called Chalav Stam. Right. We call this Chalav Stam to distinguish why it's not that's different from the lamer's milk that we buy, the traditional kind. But according to Moshe, it is Chalav Yisrael. Yeah, it's the Chacham said you have to have Chalav Yisrael. The Chazal Sofer says that means is you have to actually have the Yid watching it. Don't just figure it out. And Moshe says yes, and it is Chalav Yisrael, so to speak. It is Chalav Yisrael. Okay, so just structurally, Moshe has there are two parts to what Moshe said. Okay, there are two parts to what he said. One is the government oversight creates an Anat Sahadi. The government oversight makes us convinced that the milk we're getting is only cow's milk. That's step number one. Second is, that level of Yediyah is good enough to make it Chalav Yisrael. Okay, there are two steps there. Okay, it's not one step, it's two steps. It's not that the government oversight lets us drink it. Government oversight gives us the biru, the Anat Sahadi that it's good, and now we use that as the proof that we're allowed to eat the Chalav Yisrael. Okay, so it's a requirement back in the Doma that could only sell cow's milk? Yes, it's in all states and all federal government that milk, but you said, of course, generically milk, it has to be the mammary excretion of a bovine, whatever, from a cow. It has to come from a cow. In the United States, that's the law.
In Canada.
It's not that you can't sell cow's milk.
No, you can sell it. It's called cow's milk. If you want to get something generically, it's milk.
Something not goat's milk.
Yes, exactly. Okay. So, I'll mention it now. I can't repeat it as many times as he does, but in every single tshuva, let me just finish. In every single tshuva that Moshe talks about Chalav Yisrael, about Chalav, what we call Chalav Stam, in every single tshuva that he talks about it, he ends up by saying, even though I think that it's mutter, okay, even though I believe that it's mutter, a Baal Nefesh, or someone who's more particular and careful about his shmiras and mitzvahs, should not rely on this and should use the traditional Chalav Yisrael, eat it that way. And he talks about yeshiva spending extra money on it, all kinds of things like that. And it's so, even though he's saying that it's mutter, every time he says that it's mutter, he says, but don't forget. At the end, it always says, but don't forget. If you have a choice, and even if it's a little difficult, you should eat Chalav Yisrael. Okay, yes. No. So you forgot about it. I answered your question. There we go. Okay.
There's no difference between when the xer of milk, of a cow's milk, any milk, right? Goat's milk would go into the same getter,
yes.
right? Okay.
Yes, goat's milk also needs chalav. Yes, that's good.
How far is that different from Yetzer V'Nichtas? Yetzer V'Nichtas is also the same concept, basically. He's not eyeballing, he's not seeing it.
So unfortunately, you had a chas last week. But there, Tyson says, no, unfortunately for this, to answer your question, the Tyson says that even though you didn't have Re'iyah, since you were able to see, that's what Chacham meant. When the Chacham said you have to see, they didn't mean you should see, they meant you should be able to see. It's what Tyson means. They're understanding that you're actually seeing it. I didn't physically, that counts as if I saw it. So this is even very different. In this, no one has even possibility of seeing it. You're sitting at home, and they're milking it, 100 miles away. Okay.
Those people that say that he was only matter b'shas al-chag in America at that time, and today he wouldn't be matter.
Okay, they're entitled to say that. Let me say this: the thing that he says would explain the Shulchan today also. But what you're saying is the other side of it, which is, but if you're real Baal Nefesh, it should be makbid.
No. They're not saying Baal Nefesh. That's clearly the Shulchan. They're saying today, when it's easily available to Israel, he would not be makbid.
So I'm saying is that's
he would say that it's more than what I did, but nobody should be reading Simon Khan because you can get hold. Okay, that's what they say.
Okay, so all I'm saying that you're saying is that the in the balance of it's really mutter versus it's better to eat the other one. Nowadays, he would have leaned more heavily onto the you should not eat it.
So in the 80s, it wasn't available everywhere.
Okay, so.
That's not what to say.
They can say whatever they want. They can say what they want.
They didn't live in the Opensville.
That's a separate thing.
So now,
in New York or in Chicago.
Okay, so now in those who disagree with Rav Moshe, there are many, as you of course know. Many of the people who disagree with Moshe don't disagree in a formal way. They just say is, some Sefer said you have to have you watching it, that's it, you have to watch it. Okay? So, but of the people who wrote it, the truth is that the Chelkas Yaakov is the one who wrote the most extensive tshuva and really directed right at what Rav Moshe says. He's like point by point on what Rav Moshe says. He's the most really written on the point. There are others who spoke about it, and most people just say, "Oh, the Chasam said you have to watch it." That's it. They close their ears to it. Others, but the Yaakov is the one who has the most direct discussion on what Rav Moshe said. So I said to you, Rav Moshe has two parts. One is that the government oversight creates an Anan Sahadi, and the second is Anan Sahadi is good enough to make the milk Chalav Yisrael. So, in the first part, up to the first part of does the government oversight create this Anan Sahadi? I didn't see anybody in print arguing on the detail. Does their oversight really do it? Although there are plenty of people who are not so comfortable saying that the government does such a great job to make this. Who's?
The Nevada sugar.
Okay. And the Chelkas Yaakov does say, but he says, government makes their decisions as to whether something is real or not. Is it really milk or is it not milk? Through sampling and testing. And he says, what would be if a Yid would do that? What would be if a Yid would sample the milk, not the government? Let's say if I would go ahead and sample milk and decide, through my sampling, I've determined that this is cow's milk. Would that be enough to make it close? If I went to Bangladesh and I went over there and I sampled the milk and I said, yeah, this is really cow's milk. Would that be good enough? He says, no, it wouldn't be. He says, I don't think it would be good enough. So how can I rely on the government that their whole basis is because of sampling?
I think wrong with the first part when I talk about Israel. Where it says, what do you kosher for? So if you're heroes, you go different tests.
No.
So,
that Gemara is saying, why would they have made a Gzera in the first place?
Right.
If there's no sense to it, we wouldn't make a Gzera. But now if there is a Gzera, the Gzera might require better than just sampling. I'm going to ask you, I'm not going to answer you because it's going to be Richard's going to be in 2 times. When we talk about whether you could do video monitoring, that's where the shadows really going to come up. Or whether you have to, whether this kind of sampling works. We're not going to have time to do all of it, but there are 5. I count 5 variations of how people argue on the second part. Okay, the second thing Rav Moshe said was, it is an Anatzahadi, but the second part is, and an Anatzahadi is good enough to make it Chalav Stam. Okay, so I count 5 variations of how people argue on that part. Okay, a number of them are not arguing on the theory of it. They're arguing on, so to speak, on the facts on the ground. There being many rayas that even though you have a raya like an Anatzahadi, it doesn't work. So they're not explaining why. Rav Moshe has this whole pile of rayas that Anatzahadis work all over the place. They say, I don't know what to tell you. Here's a whole bunch of rayas that it's not working. Okay, even it goes to the point that the Zakan Aaron, when he talks about it, he mamash describes it. He says even though there's emas hadin hakosher haroivitz akol mezayiv schora. Okay, there's really, he says even so it's a takana. So he's not even bringing a raya. Others bring rayas from the Ramah, bring rayas from different places that these what would usually work in Kalatari Kul doesn't work over here. So among the explanations they give, that they're not really explaining why it's not an Anatzahadi, but they say, for example, there are rayas that for certain very important things, the Chachamim were extra makbid. And they had special rules of what kind of rayas you have to bring. They made extra strict rules for certain things. And milk is such a crucial food that Chacham chose to make an extra strong rule over here. Okay, that's not really explaining the Anatzahadi. They're just sort of saying it's a special Gzeres HaKosher. It's not it's a drabanan. Others say, they bring from Chacham Tzvi, that when we try to judge how good of a raya something is, we have umdanas, we have umdanas demuchachs, we have yediyah beruras, we have Anatzahadis, we have all these different levels, and at this point in history, we're not so sophisticated enough to understand that. We can't judge whether something is a little like this or a little like this. So the Chachamim, looking to the future, that people would get, there'd be very, ambiguous cases, and people wouldn't know, should they be Meko, should they be Machmir, is this a Yediyah, or is this just a Yediyah? How exactly, where does it classify? Chacham said, no, we don't want any problems over here, everyone has to eat, the Yid has to actually watch it. Don't make rayas that would usually work in Kalatari Kul, you have to use only this very specific raya that we had in mind, okay? And we're going to hear, Emir Hashem, next time, that exact concern, that people would stretch the idea of what's considered a raya and what's considered an Anatzahadi. We're going to mamash here about that. That's next time, is to talk about modern day examples of people stretching these ideas to even to cases that are really very questionable. Okay, and we're not going to go through his points, but the Chelkas Yaakov, in what I think is almost like the heart of his tshuva, goes almost point by point through what Rav Moshe says. And every one of his rayas, he says why it's either not a raya, why that's a very special thing in that case. He goes through every single case of why this case, that's the reason why the Chacham said it, or it's not true. He almost goes like point by point to each one of the rayas Rav Moshe brings to say why he thinks that a Anatzahadi in this kind of a case would not be good enough. Okay? So we've heard, Rav Moshe has his reason to say why it's an Anatzahadi. We quickly ran through these other reasons people had to say we're not comfortable that relying on an Anatzahadi over here, and that's end up being sort of, we'll call it a machlokes as to whether you could eat Chalav Stam or you shouldn't eat Chalav Stam. Okay, now, but really, we need to understand where Rav Moshe said a drop further, and once we hear this, go through this explanation, I think we'll find out that a lot of the things that the people said actually are not as strong as they thought it was. Okay, when we get a better understanding of what Moshe really meant, or what I think he really meant, what I'm about to say is, based on, you'll hear what I'm saying it from, I don't see it in the truth itself, but it helps me understand what he says, and if we understand that, a lot of these points are not as strong after you hear that. And that's what it is. We have to just ask a few questions. If you went over to someone in the street and said to them, do you think that the milk in your container is really from a cow? They say, of course it is. Okay, why do you think so? Why do you think that the milk is there from a cow? They're not going to say, because the government does oversight. They're going to say, of course not, because everybody milks in America is cows. Nobody milks anything else. If they milk anything else, some Meshachar milks it, he sells that strange milk. Why do Moshe need to say that the government oversight is what makes it an Ansahadi? You don't need government oversight for what was he trying to add by that? That there was government oversight to make that an Ansahadi. It's not an Ansahadi. Everybody knows that the cow's milk is cow's milk. It's just like anything else that you have a confidence. You walk into the store and you see something with, not in every case, but we live in a kind of a society where we look at things and we say, that's what people are doing. Milk is even more so because there's a zillion cows in America. I forgot how many there are. I had the statistics. How many cows there are and how much milk they're making from it and how easy it is to make cow's milk. Of course no one's putting in horses milk.
Like Rabbi Schwartz would say, right?
Yeah, so why did Moshe need to say that? What was his point in throwing in this thing about the government oversight to the point that in the second tshuva, the person wrote back to him and said to him, you really mean this government oversight? He says, you know what the fines are? It's a little, almost like a slap on the wrist to the guy. That counts also? I said, yeah, that's good enough. So what do you need to get into that? That people should, so to speak, nitpick on whether the government is good oversight, it's not good oversight. It seems like the people have, if you want to say it's an Ansahadi, everybody knows that it's cow's milk. How does everybody know that? Because of course it is. It's partial. The kind of society we live in makes us feel like that, not because of the government per se. It's not Emaz, Hadin, Haroivet, whatever the other person said.
That could have been originally why we think that way, that since we know the government...
Okay, maybe that could be.
But
okay, I guess that could be.
Wouldn't help here anyhow.
Right.
This is something because you need the eyes seeing it.
Right. Okay, so the I mentioned last time, the Beis Meir says that the Beis Meir asked the question. He says, how could the Pri Chadash say that there's such an example of a city that doesn't have a davar tummy? Every city's got cows in it, has horses in it. There's no such thing as a city with no davar tummy. So what was the explanation? Well, what did the Pri Chadash mean? What's the machlokes about? What's the case that they're arguing about? The case they're arguing about is where there's no animals in the city that anybody would find reasonable to milk. People living in Iowa, in Milwaukee, they don't think of milking horses. It doesn't occur to them that a horse is a milkable item. In their mind, all you milk is cows, so there's nothing within reason. That is to say, the machlokes is not in a case where there's no treif milk. It's where the machlokes is in a case where there is treif milk, but it's like so far-fetched that it would get mixed in that it has in a certain way we would say there's no treif milk around. But there is treif milk. We're not in such a, not like the Gemara's case, where the corral only has kosher animals. There are treif milk around, but it's not there. So, the Chacham Stam, who argues on the Pri Chadash, he doesn't use his name, but he says, he disagrees with what Pri Chadash says the following. He says, the amount of birur that we have, that they're only using cow's milk, would be good enough for all dini haTorah. For all regular dinim, that much birur is good enough. The way we would say it in the way we talk, we would say is that there isn't a mere hamatzi of people putting in treif milk, and therefore for regular dini haTorah we would not have to be choishes that happens. That's how we would classify. He doesn't use those words, but the idea is it's so remote that the dini haTorah would tell us not to be worried about. However, the Chacham made a takana. The takana is don't rely on those regular rules. And the Chacham Stam says, and therefore, if there's any possibility that there's treif milk in there, even if it's far-fetched, you still have to be choshesh. He says, but that's different than Gvinas Yisrael. We're going to get to Gvinas Yisrael. The Gvinas Yisrael, the takana of Gvinas Yisrael is even stricter. The takana of Gvinas Yisrael is that even if you're 100% sure that they use kosher rennet, you're still not allowed to use it. And look, this takana is, if there's any possibility, you have to eat Chalav Yisrael. If there's no possibility, you don't have to eat it. As opposed to Gvinas Yisrael, where even if there's no possibility to use
non-kosher
treif rennet, you're still not allowed to eat it. Okay, so he's machalik between... I'll tell you in a second. He's machalik between Chalav Yisrael and Gvinas Yisrael. That Chalav Yisrael is, Chacham said, don't, even if it's far-fetched, you still have to be choishes. But if it's impossible, then you don't have to be choishes. Okay, that's different than Gvinas Yisrael. So now, if we go back 100 years ago, okay, We go back to the situation where the Chasam Sofer is dealing with 100 years ago. I know he lived more than 100 years ago, but for our purposes, we go back 100 years ago, and we're dealing with a situation. We deal with the situation that he was living with. Was there treif milk around? Yeah, of course there was treif milk. There were horses. Of course there were horses. How do you think they got to work? They got on the horse. So there was, of course, there was treif milk around. So was it possible that treif milk got mixed in? Of course it was possible. It was far-fetched. So we would say is 99% sure we could be that there was they did not mix in treif milk. We couldn't be 100% because the treif milk was still around, but 99% we could be. Takanas Chacham is, even if you're 99% sure, in a din Torah you would be way overboard, you'd for sure be allowed to eat it. In this case, the Chacham said to be machmer. But comes along the government oversight, and comes along the small fines, the fact that the government could theoretically close a person down and take a strong hand on a person who cheated. And the Mela, that's what pushes us from being 99% sure to making us 100% sure. We don't need the government to be a raya that he didn't use cow's milk. We're basically there on our own, but 99% we all know, we're all comfortable that the person is using cow's milk, because what else would he use? And no one even dreamed that he uses horse's milk in there. The government oversight is, like Rav talks about it, that the person, if he ever had a havamina to make this big collusion, to get everybody together to slip in some treif milk, what would stop him from doing that last little thing, that possibility of this big scheme to cheat everybody, is the government looking over his shoulder. So what the government is doing is making it 100% sure, and the Chacham Stam says that according to the Chasam Sofer, doesn't use his name, the Chacham Stam said, according to the Chasam Sofer, if you'd be 100% sure, that would be a key with the Takanas Chachamim. The Takanas Chachamim is not that a Yid should watch it. The Takanas Chachamim is that a Yid should be 100% sure. That usually means that Yid has to watch it, because there's even a tiny possibility that's enough to us. Okay? So I'll throw in here, for those of you who are keeping score, the etzem, it's not really 100% sure. Okay? I don't think that you need to be 100% sure. Because if I have to say you have to be 100% sure, then you'll respond back to me, there was once one Meshugana in Lexington, and this is what he did, and that's the end of the 100% sure. Okay? So the truth is, Rabbi Schachter says in his article about, what he wrote about tuna fish, that really there's no place in the Torah that a person is required to be 100% sure. Okay? And he brings, the Chasam Sofer himself says, that if something happens only once in 1,000, that doesn't count even for a mayor who's choshesh l'miyuta, even in the most cases where the most machmir, even choshesh for sakana, even things like that, even 1 in 1,000 never ever counts that you have to be choshesh for it. It's so far-fetched that even for any dini haTorah you're not mechuyev to count for it. So that is to say is that we're not looking to be 100%. To be 100% you have to be, it's really beyond 99.9%. But and 100% means I can knock you off with one story that happened otherwise. That's the end of your 100%. And some of these posts can bring, there are horror stories of what happened to people. So we only have to be 99. I believe that you only need to be 99.9%. Okay. So one funny thing is, of course, is that if you're listening, is that it comes out that, in my way of thinking, the OU's two most famous coolers, Chalav Stam and tuna fish, are l'shitase. Right now it comes out they're l'shitase because they're two totally one another. Okay, so for those people who don't like them for both of those reasons, because the Chasam Sofer would say you have to be 99% sure, who was matter the tuna fish, and now also being matter the Chalav Stam also. Okay.
That's a whole different reason. You got to see it.
Okay. Now, I do have to tell you, in honesty, that what Rav Schachter said, that the Chasam Sofer says 1 in 1,000 doesn't count, is not fully accurate. It's not exactly what the Chasam Sofer says. The Chasam Sofer is talking about, should you be choshesh if a person is declared dead, should you be choshesh that he's really alive, and he might wake up. And therefore, don't bury him too quickly, because he might wake up, and he might not be dead yet. Okay, that's what he's talking about. So the Chasam Sofer says, the possibility, the fact that once in 1,000 years, somebody wakes up after we thought he was dead, that doesn't make a difference. You don't have to be choshesh for that possibility. Okay, so once in 1,000 years, someone waking up, okay, according to a historian who I spoke to, there were about 7,000 Yidden living in Pressburg when the Chasam Sofer was alive. Okay? So if you're only talking about the Yidden, and only in that city, it would come out that once in 1,000 years would be 100,000 people. Okay, so it's 1 in 100,000, not really 1 in 1,000. Okay, so what the numbers
So
are.
use the number 1,000, or B'Shefta use the number 1,000?
The Chalav Stam says, if once in 1,000 years a person wakes up, that doesn't mean anything. And Rabbi Shefta says, he's saying that 1 in 1,000 chance is not, you don't have to be Choshesh for.
1,000 chance. It's not so low.
No, so I'm saying
Did you ask him that?
no, I didn't ask him that. So 1 in 1,000 chance is not what the Chalav Stam says. The Chalav Stam says it's 1 in 100,000 chance. So it's not exactly the same. 1 in 1,000 years is not 1 in 1,000 times, right? And we don't even know the Chalav Stam was in the press book. 1 in 1,000, of course, for the readers of this man will know that there are lots of people who have woken up dead. Okay, for those of you who read this man, woken up dead, who woke up who they thought were dead. They collected every story that ever happened in history. But the Chalav Stam says 1 in 1,000 is not exactly what it is. Okay, so. Here we go. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So so it comes out that Moshe is saying it's really in the Chacham Sodom and the Beis Meir. Both Chacham Sodom and Beis Meir both say that if we had a raya 100% sure that the milk was coming from a yid, we would not have to have a yid watching it. If it came from a cow, we would not have to have a person watching it. That's what he says. Both the Beis Meir and the Chacham Sodom are saying that, and I believe that's what Moshe means to make with the government oversight. And it could be that many of the rayas that people brought to many of the rayas that the Pri Chadash brought to say what he was right, that you don't need to have a raya, you don't need to have a Takanas Chacham, that it's not Takanas Chacham. Those rayas really are what drives the Chacham Sodom to say that Chalav Yisrael and Gvinis Yisrael are not the same. Remember last time we spoke about the Pri Chadash had rayas that it's not Takanas Chacham. So those rayas, what these people are understanding is it's not true. Really, this is Takanas Chacham. What about all his rayas? They just help us understand what kind of Takan it is. It's not like the Takan of Gvinis Yisrael that even if it's 100% you have to have a yid there, but this is you have to get it to 100%. Maybe those two complicated. Yeah. And I have to just make one last point, which is what I told you that the Chacham Sodom says that the Takan of Chalav Yisrael is not like Gvinis Yisrael. We have to mention that the Kesef Mishnah says not like that. Okay, the Kesef Mishnah that I mentioned before, who says that it's a takana of Chalav Yisrael. He says it's exactly like Gvinis Yisrael. He sure sounds like that's what he means. That's exactly like Gvinis Yisrael. That even if you're 100% sure, you still have to do it. But so that's so to speak another reason to argue on this. But I believe the Ramesh is saying based on the Chacham Sodom and the Beis Meir, who both say that if you're 100% sure, then you don't need a yid to watch.